My little flame went on. Okay, welcome to today's webinar. Please note that today's call is being recorded. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. Except for the speakers, all participants' lines are muted. During the presentation, you may enter a question at any time simply by typing it in the chat box, then clicking the send button. We will save time to respond to questions sent during the presentation in the Q&A portion toward the end of the webinar. I will now turn it over to the moderator for today's discussion, Jasmine Hall-Ratliff.
Thank you, Tahani. Welcome, everyone. I am Jasmine Hall-Ratliff, and I'm so excited to be here with you all this afternoon. Building on the momentum and socio-political opportunities to reverse environmental racism and advance climate justice, Race to the Board was born. This two-pronged approach is intended to disrupt current practices that are not bringing sufficient levels of Black leadership to the boards of environmental and conservation organizations. R2B, which is what we call Race to the Board shorthand, aims to identify ways to cultivate more equitable and inclusive board practices while amplifying Black voices and participation in leadership roles within the environmental and conservation fields. Expanding on the recommendations made in the R2B report, a toolkit was developed to provide actionable steps and resources for preparing boards of green groups to recruit and retain Black leaders. It serves as a supplement to the R2B pilot research completed last fall and is a call to action for the environmental and conservation fields to move towards organizational transformation. The purpose of this session is to challenge your thinking about Black leadership among environment and conservation grant-making organizations as it relates to racial equity and justice practices. This webinar will center the experiences of Black environmental leaders as they seek to join the boards of green groups, along with their experiences once they are on those boards. The session will also introduce key points of the recently released Race to the Board Toolkit, now available on the INDEEP website. At the conclusion of this webinar, participants will be able to understand the impact of the historic and current funding gap between white and BIPOC-led climate organizations. They'll understand why representation matters in terms of diversity and inclusion on the boards of climate organizations. And lastly, they'll identify effective strategies for readiness, recruitment, and retention of Black leaders to join environmental and conservation boards. So we have three wonderful speakers joining us today. First is Latrice Sneed, who is the CEO of the Bonsai Leadership Group. Secondly, Nathaniel Smith is the founder and chief equity officer of the Partnership for Southern Equity. And lastly, Rose McKinney James is the founder and principal of McKinney James Associates. You can read more about our speakers through the links that are being placed in the chat. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We will jump right into our first question. So Race to the Board, the report found that some boards have been operating with a racial equity lens for years, while others are only beginning their journey. Likewise, the level of understanding regarding structural racism and environmental justice is uneven, with few board leaders demonstrating a tangible recognition of the connection between structural racism and the work the organization is doing. And we'll start with Rose. How do green groups recognize the intersectionality of environmental and conservation work and social and racial justice to gain support among Black communities most affected?
Well, thank you, Jasmine. First off, let me say I'm delighted to be here and I'm happy that you're undertaking this topic. That is a challenging question. I've given it some thought. I think the reality is that every organization has its own culture, its own approach to the work. But the first thing I think is recognizing that you really do have to be intentional. There has to be a clear recognition that in order to achieve some of the long-term goals that these organizations identify, that they have to ensure that the allocation of their resources is a reflection of the communities where they want to see that change occur, which means that it has to be a top down and throughout the organization cultural shift to ensure that the organizations actually include at the board level and beyond, board level being where much of the oversight and strategy is undertaken, appreciates the need to be inclusive. That is to ensure that the board itself represents the communities where they want to conduct business, and that the strategy that they undertake appreciates the fact that much of what green groups are trying to do has disproportionate implications for communities of color and underserved communities. So being intentional, creating space on the board, creating space within the strategy would be the two things that I would at least tee up as initial thoughts.
Thanks, Nathan. Oh, go ahead, Latrice.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off of what Rose said, because it's that intentionality piece that resonates for me the most. You know, a lot of green groups will say that they want to, you know, reach out to Black communities or provide some new programming, but what you'll have is the board saying this is mission drift, you know. So breaking out of that mindset of what the mission has been and what it needs to be is part of that intentionality too, that I think Rose is speaking towards. I've been in organizations, large white green organizations, where great programs have been developed, but the board says, no, we're not going to fund that because it doesn't meet our mission. So I think that flexibility of that board to think outside of what they have normally done and think towards the future is really necessary.
And Nathaniel, do you have anything to follow up on?
Yes, I think it's also really important for all green organizations to understand that they are not immune to white oppression, and that white oppression permeates every aspect of American and global life. And it's also important for them to understand the history that white oppression has reflected in its treatment and interactions with Black communities. The first real expression of extreme extraction in America was the extraction of slaves from Africa and the extraction of land from indigenous populations. And so that the energy that was utilized to create our economy in America, and even from a transatlantic perspective in terms of colonialism, the energy of slaves is not too different from the energy that we utilize from fossil fuels to create dirty energy and affect many of the communities of color, Black communities that surround those dirty energy creating facilities. We also have to understand that that land that was taken from indigenous populations, that again was used to drive America's economy, is also a reflection of that extreme extraction. And that history is not separate from the history of not only the environmental sector, but also all sectors. And so the organizations in question must be willing to be a disruptor of that system and that history, and understand that if they're not a part of the solution, then they are a part of the problem. And so it is a matter of understanding history, understanding how that history is connected to their organizations, and how every day they must play a part in disrupting the residue and the conditional and ways that Black folks are seen and are allowed to engage in their work on a day-to-day basis.
Thanks to all of you. I want to pick up on a couple of threads that relate to our next question. Rose and Latrice and Nathaniel have all mentioned ways that organizations can be intentional, some steps of things that they need to do, think outside the box, start with the board and strategy. What are some of the ways that big green groups need to change to ensure they adopt more equitable, inclusive practices? If you were to say the top 2 or 3 first steps that these organizations need to take, and this builds upon some suggestions made in the Race to the Board toolkit. So Latrice, I'll go back to you in starting that question.
I think one of the things that I've learned from some of these big green groups is that it's easy to have trainings, it's easy to have listening sessions, conversations, talk about, and statements, talking about what they would like to do, right? And then there becomes a time when it's a challenge to accomplish their goals or to see movement. And then you start to see the friction of staff that want to see action. One of the things that I've realized is that an organization will say what they want to do, but they don't put the money and the commitment behind what they would like to see achieved. So there always becomes a time when an organization says, well, we have this intention to do this, but we just don't have the funding. Well, you have the funding to buy that preserve. You have that funding to invest in other programs. You have that funding to have that beautiful board meeting. So how come you don't set aside the same money that you would for any other important conservation purpose in your organization to be intentional and successful around your DEI measures? I will also say that one of the things that I've noticed, especially this is bringing back in boards, many boards have minimums. If you want to sit on a board, you're going to donate, a board member is going to donate money. Why can't every board member donate part of their funds to go towards DEI so that they are also part of that that value and saying this is important, not only to the organization, but to us as a board as well. I think also one of the things that is missed is in accountability are the metrics. So I used to work at the Nature Conservancy, and we used to have this conversation all the time about how can we see movement on DEI? Well, one of the big missteps was that no one was being held accountable for success in those areas. So no one is going to spend time or focus on anything that they are not measured by. People were being measured by how much money they raised, by the programs they created, how much conservation impact that they saw, but they weren't being measured on their impact on DEIJ. So that's one of those areas where I think people forget about how do you hold your staff and the board accountable through metrics. And following up on that, what happens when people don't achieve those goals? Not that we just set it aside and say, oh, try again next year, but what really happens?
I think those are really insightful observations around the challenge that we face. But I think to extend that, I want to focus on retention and recruitment. I want to focus on making sure that the folks who have a seat at the table, who have a voice, who have the ability to exercise some actual decision-making, are actively involved in how those metrics are determined. So at the board level and at the staff level, at the grant-making level, you have to have people in the room who have the lived experience and the connections to the communities that are necessary to make some of those funding decisions. And to your point, Latrice, every board is a little different. I think, for my bio that I've served on the board of the Energy Foundation for a number of years. I've actually had 2 tours on that board. And it's only been recently that we've been able to do what I call some very intentional recruitment at the board level and at the senior management level, because organizations need to reflect at all levels participation from the communities where they want to conduct work. We don't have a requirement for fundraising. The Energy Foundation is based on philanthropy, but we redirect money that comes from other large organizations. And so that's why I focused so heavily on strategy. That strategy has to include making sure that you get funds to local organizations that are going to be heavily impacted by climate, by conservation requirements, so that there is direct participation. So I'm saying top down, starting at the board, being intentional around recruitment, and having the ability to retain. I know we're going to talk about that a little later as we advance in this conversation, but you got to be able to have a culture and an environment that is attractive to people that look like us.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I also think that it's really important for people to understand that at the end of the day, when we're talking about organizations, in particular big green organizations, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And you can develop as many strategies as possible, but if you're not working to address the cultural residue of white oppression within organizations, you can have as many pretty reports and strategies as possible, but that organization will always go back, unfortunately, to that history that continues to perpetuate the injustices that we're experiencing. What do I mean by that? Well, I think that organizations must be willing, particularly white-led big greens, to move from a missionary mentality to a movement mentality. Historically, big green organizations have looked at Black communities in particular as communities that change should happen to and not with. That they come into these communities proselytizing the gospel of environmental stewardship without understanding that many Black and Indigenous communities were the first environmentalists. So how can we begin to look at these communities as co-laborers in this work and not people that need to be turned or civilized as it relates to the work that is required around environmental justice and climate change and reformation and transformation. Also, I think it's very important for big greens in particular to work to ensure that their board members are systems thinkers, that they have a clear understanding about how systems work and how systems can really play a part in continuing to perpetuate many of the challenges that Black communities are facing and other historically disinvested communities of color. So some real time has to be done in really training board members and understanding systems and how organizations, big greens in particular, can play a role in disrupting those systems. The third thing is, and this is what I think has been a real challenge as well, is that a lot of times big greens conflate diversity, equity, and inclusion. And if you want to add justice to that as well, all three of those are different. And all three of those require different efforts and also should be evaluated utilizing different metrics and different benchmarks. And I think a lot of times boards in particular and big greens conflate all four of those in a way where the outcomes and the impact measures are pretty much the same. And so I think it requires a deeper dive in understanding from those organizations, how are you defining success within the context of diversity, and then equity, and then inclusion, and then justice. So I think it takes a lot of time and deep reflection and learning to get to some of the inclusive and more just strategies that we're talking about. And last, but certainly not least, and again, I don't want to go too deep, but I think that we also have to continue to push people to understand that there's a difference between Black-led organizations and Black-governed organizations. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times when we are engaged with these organizations, they believe that if they can just hire Black people in positions of leadership, or hire a Black person to be the leader of that particular organization, then the culture of white oppression will slowly slip away and dissolve. And it doesn't work like that, because the culture still remains the same. I've seen many organizations that have hired brown people, but at the same time are continuing to still perpetuate the injustices that we're seeing in Black communities, this extractive culture of engagement that is more based on, again, a missionary culture than a movement culture. So all of those things are critical. And when you're able to change those things, when organizations like the Big Greens continue to begin to look at communities of color, in particular Black communities, as assets and not liabilities, when they move from a missionary mentality to a movement building mentality, when they begin to understand the role of systems and commit to leveraging their organization, the capacity to disrupt that, and begin to understand the difference between diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and begin the process of understanding that just because you have Black presidents or vice presidents, that white oppression still exists in your organization, then I think we'll be able to move forward collectively.
So Nathaniel, I want to stick with you on this thread around recruitment and lift it up to the leadership level, as you've been talking about, or the governance level, sorry. So board leaders have said that they do want to build a pipeline to Black communities and broaden their organization's network of recruitment. And they've reported recruitment methods that include hiring a DEI recruiter or an executive search firm, creating junior boards and paid fellowships and internships to sort of create a pipeline to their board, and rethinking term limits and governance structure and requirements to join a board. What's missing in these strategies, and how can some of these strategies be improved?
Well, I think one of the things that they have to realize is that just because they build the pipeline doesn't mean that the talent is on the other end to leverage, right? That I think that many of these organizations must play just as much of a role in funding and supporting frontline organizations and leadership development outside of their organizations in ways that will help to, till the soil and grow the amount of leadership that is needed to really play a critical role in their organizations in a different way, right? So I think, pipelines are good, but what are you doing beyond the pipeline to ensure that Black organizations and current and emerging leaders are positioned to be successful, and then hopefully then be prepared to come in and engage in your particular organization and serve the need that is required. I also think that a lot of this stuff is really also boils down to trust. I always say that change moves at the speed of trust. What are we doing? What are Big Greens doing to ensure that leaders, in particular Black leaders, feel as if their recruitment is being done for authentic and real reasons, and not just because they want Black faces on their board that they can report out to their funders, that they're not window dressing their problems by hiring or recruiting Black board members, or hiring Black leaders to help run their organizations. But all of that doesn't happen overnight, right? It happens through relationship cultivation, or what I call relationship acceleration. It comes from showing up. It comes from also standing down. It also comes from not bringing an extractive culture as it relates to their relationships with frontline organizations and Black people. And also it's about not cultivating a one-way relationship, right, between frontline organizations and Black leaders. When Black leaders and Black organizations are in need and are standing against oppressors and negative circumstances, the Big Greens need to be willing to stand with them, not in a position of leadership, but in a position of solidarity. And I don't think that many frontline organizations and Black organizations see that a lot. And so, it's going to take time to cultivate that culture, that relational culture. But they have to be willing to do that.
That's what I was going to say about what was missing, because some of this, when organizations start talking about building pipelines and pathways, I'm like, okay, you just creating a whole nother system by which you're going to give excuses to exclude rather than include, right? And what happened to old school building a relationship with people, understanding people, seeking out people? They do this with white donors all the time. There's a whole cultivation strategies around, building a mutually beneficial relationship with these donors. So why not use the same type of strategy with communities and people of color? The other thing is, what's missing is recruiting different types of white folks to be on your board. We're always looking at how we reach out and recruit, people of color, Black folks, Indigenous folks, and everything is focused on that strategy. And we want to train white people to, accept their privilege. But why not start from the very beginning? And if there are white folks that you would like on the board, pick them with that lens in mind. Are they already aware of their privilege? Have they demonstrated that they understand or have built relationships with communities of color? So think about who you are also reaching out to in terms of the whiteness that you're bringing onto your board.
So if I could go back, I think it was Nathaniel who made the comment that some of this is a function of systems. We've not gotten away from the systemic issues that impact how decision-making is conducted across the board in this country. And you'll all recall when we were fortunate enough to have our first Black president, that there were those who thought that racism had suddenly come to an end, like it was going to vanish. And of course, we know the underlying reality is that that was very far from the truth. So there are those organizations that do what I call a check the box exercise around their view of execution on DEI and environmental justice issues. It's all about optics. And the ability to see through that and the ability to challenge that comes from the willingness of folks to stand up. So the trust issue is real. The issue around credibility is real. And to your point, Latrice, the way to challenge that is around metrics and accountability and embedding that into the culture of the organization. It's easily said, not always easily achieved, but the more the issue is raised and the more pushback the communities are able to provide, hopefully we'll see greater and more lasting change in this arena.
Thanks to all of you. And Rose, I wanted to pick back up on a topic you mentioned a little earlier that you wanted to dive in on a little bit, and that's around retention. The R2B report stated that while some board leaders did see great challenges with retaining Black board members once they've been recruited, others described racism and microaggressions that may result in harm from inauthentic inclusion. And so what causes Black leaders to stay on or leave boards? And what organizational changes or reforms need to be made within these green groups to create and support an inclusive board culture?
Well, let me offer just a couple of thoughts. Your questions are comprehensive, I have to say, but listen, nobody wants to be a part of an organization where they don't feel welcome, where they don't feel connected. And so some effort has to be undertaken to ensure that there is a mutual understanding of the benefits of having a Black board member. And a Black board member need not feel like they are there just for, as I said, to check the box or for the optics. They need to feel that they are there to make a meaningful contribution in the overall governance of the organization. One of the things that we've undertaken for one of my boards is actual DEI training, an actual assessment For the first time, some of the non-diverse members of the board are forced to come to terms with their own thinking about how they interact with BIPOC community representatives. Things that they, I mean, we talk a lot about subconscious bias. Well, it's also real. But taking the steps to do that assessment and having an open and candid conversation about it in an inclusive way where everyone's involved and we're not just singling out the Black member of the board or the brown member of the board, where the entire board is required to participate, I think is one step that can address some of the inequities. It's not like we're going to change society and turn it on its ear. Because again, Nathaniel makes the point that there's a tremendous amount of history embedded in how these decisions are made. But I do think that being thoughtful and intentional about how you pick all of the board members, whether or not they are diverse members or not, and I think Latrice made this point, will make a difference in terms of how that culture evolves. So we need to weed out the folks who don't find this to be an important aspect of the board governance work that they're undertaking. If they don't see the importance of DNI, then they don't need to be on the board. And so you need to think about every year as you're nominating your board members, what the board looks like and whether or not that culture is actually advancing an inclusive environment. And I'll stop there. I'm sure that the other panelists have some other thoughts.
Yeah, either Nathaniel or Latrice.
I'll just say that, and again, and that's why it's really important to really stratify and deconstruct the differences between diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, because sometimes the work around diversity could actually conflict with the work that needs to be done around equity. And the work around inclusion can sometimes conflict with the work that's being done around diversity. Let's be clear, whiteness is a political and cultural construct. It's not racial. It's not about just the melanin in someone's skin. It's a socio-political and economic construct, right? That has been designed to maintain this hierarchy of value placed on the color of someone's skin, right? So you could actually have someone who is Black that is actually still continuing to perpetuate whiteness, right? And so it's really important to make sure that when you're recruiting Black candidates, that you're also working to ensure that diversity is also positioned in a way to, again, be disruptive, right? In the way that things are being done. I've dealt with many people who look like me, who still are trying to maintain a status quo that continues to hurt my people, right? So we have to find ways to be a little bit more sophisticated when we think about recruitment and think about, and have clear metrics, as Ms. Rose said, around like, what are we really looking for? What are we trying to accomplish? What are we trying to disrupt? Right? And how will that person play a role in ensuring that work that we're trying to do is actually going to be realized? Or are we just recruiting people that make us feel comfortable? Are we just recruiting people that don't look threatening? Are we recruiting people that we say are articulate? Those are things that we have to always be mindful of. And I think that Big Greens need to be very mindful of that as well. It's not about looking for a board candidate that's just them dipped in chocolate, right? It's about, how can we begin the process of trying to find people who can play a role in really elevating a new way forward and work to disrupt cultures that continue to hurt the communities that you say you care about.
Well, it's funny. I had to chuckle, Nathaniel. I think we all did when you said someone that looks like you but dipped in chocolate, because I think a lot of times organizations, that's what they get excited about, right? or there's excitement over, oh, wow, yes, we could really use your voice on this board. But when you do sit down and use your voice, it's like, whoa, hold on. That's not how the board works, or we're not ready for that yet. You know, so there's this fear once you start using that voice. So you want my Black body, but you don't want my Black voice at the table, right? And so part of this is, how does the CEO, the board chair, and other executive board members uphold and make space for people to actually share their authentic voice in those spaces and say, we need this voice, you know? But most times what happens is people are quiet, and after the meeting they go, I'm so glad you said that, because that's how I feel too. No, don't tell me behind closed doors after the meeting, tell me in the meeting. And some of that has to be that intentionality behind the board chair and those executive members of the board to help create and shift that culture so that people feel comfortable in bringing their whole selves and their voice, and not just the body dipped in chocolate.
And thanks to all of you. I was just checking with Tahani on whether we have any questions from the audience, and we don't yet. So as people are thinking about their questions, and I'm going to give them a little bit of a warning to say, start thinking about your questions and posting them in the Q&A. I do want to allow some time for you all to share any final thoughts before we go into Q&A. So if there are any questions that you want the participants to think about when they walk, as they walk away from this event. One of the great things about being in webinars and learning events like this is that the hope is that you come out of it saying, okay, here's some things I want to take to my organization. So are there any questions that you want folks to just write down for them to kind of chew on when this is over, that they can start to think about and move forward in their own organizations?
Well, maybe one thought is around the outcomes. You know, we are talking about an outcome, which is to increase representation on boards of green groups. I'd love to know what folks think success looks like, because I'm very concerned about the potential for failure. And my concern is that expectations are, that we level set expectations, that when you think about board service, there's a dynamic to consider around governance broadly. And so I'd just be really interested to understand what success means, not just the initial appointment to the board, but what beyond that.
That's a great thought. Nathaniel or Latrice?
You know, I don't really have a lot to add here other than the questions of how can you be more bold, but how can you also hold your own self accountable to the boldness that you wish to seek? So not just saying it, but what are you going to do to hold yourself accountable to the changes that you wish to see?
Mm-hmm. And the only two things that I think both of those, I mean, from Latrice and Ms. Rose were really great. I think they're two for me. One is, what are you doing to cultivate a successful pipeline beyond the development of the pipeline? You know, what are you doing to ensure that, you know, leaders are grown, they're not made. And so what are you doing to work towards growing leaders, Black leaders, environmental and climate, EJ leaders in the community that will be able to serve on these boards in a constructive way? I think that's something that's like really, really important, you know. And what are you doing as an organization, again, to think more from a systems level, and what are you doing to play a role in disrupting many of the challenges that you played a part in helping to create. I think that's something that both are really, from my perspective, really important for Big Greens in particular to think through.
All really provocative questions for folks to ask themselves. Thanks to all of you. So I want to open it up to folks who either to post in the Q&A or to raise their hand. And we do want to open it up to participants to just ask questions or even share thoughts. We want this to be a conversation too. So if your organization has had some success retaining Black board members or are challenged by finding and retaining Black board members, we'd love to hear from you and have conversation. We have 3 wonderful experts to speak to about this. I'm just going to give folks another minute or 2. So I want to, as folks continue to think, I want to pick up, I jotted down something, Latrice, that you said earlier at the top around board concern for mission drift when they're thinking about DEI in their organizations and trying to recruit and think about diversifying board members. You know, what are some of the ways to just solidly bring home the point that that is not what this is? That there are ways to address this issue and still be front and center within your mission.
Mm-hmm. I think one way to think about this is through a strategic plan. So being thoughtful and strategic, not necessarily to focus necessarily on the mission as heavily as where do you want the organization to be in the next 5 years? And then what do you need to get there? Because you can't possibly get there without Black folks, you know? And so coming to the point of making sure that everybody sees it as it's necessary as part of that strategy in order to therefore then achieve the mission. I think that, you know, when people say mission drift, it's just a quick excuse.
It is. It's exactly what it is. And it comes from the discomfort associated with sitting board members who are concerned about their ongoing relevance, in my view. Also those who are short-sighted around what the mission is. So my argument obviously is not mission drift, it should be mission specific. And it should also be a point of how you drive resources and where how those resources are allocated and who is in the decision chain. That takes me back, I think, to my first point. So the board, the strategy, senior management, those who are making decisions on the grants, because that's what I'm most familiar with, on the ground, and importantly, on the ground. So the importance here is that while organizations and the culture is supposed to be focused on a mission, a stated mission, how you execute on that mission in terms of who's impacted and who benefits from the resources that are being allocated, those are the key decisions, I think. And a lot of board members, especially those that have been long-term, well-intentioned, care about environmental issues, just have never given any thought to the reality of who is really impacted by some of the decisions that they've made over time. And now they're being held to a different standard of accountability, as well they should.
And Rose, you started something that I wanted to pick up on, connected to one of Nathaniel's comments early on, and that's the history. You know, green groups and environmental groups have come up in the recent year or year and a half or so, related to especially those who have founders that have been lifted up and elevated for so long. And then it came to light that their founders were, we'll just say it outright, racist individuals. How do some of these organizations, just what are those first steps that they need to start taking to think about history and culture and start to move that ship, if you will, to turn the corner towards understanding where they're connected and what that means for increasing diversity in board leadership, particularly bringing more Black people into board leadership? Like, how do they even begin to grapple that? And I'm starting with Nathaniel on that, since you first brought that issue up. Oh, you're muted still. Yep.
Yeah, I think it's also about harm, right? I mean, it's about history, it's about culture, but it's also about harm. You know, before healing can occur, there needs to be an acknowledgement that harm has been created and done. And I think a lot of times being a big green means never having to say you're sorry. Right. And we've got to find a way to move past that. And I think it's our responsibility as well in the field as Black leaders and Black organizations to say it's not enough to say you want to partner with us. We need to take the time for us to really move towards reconciliation and healing before we can really create an authentic relationship with you. We've had to do that as an organization on several occasions with many big greens. And when you bring it to them in that way, there's an opportunity then for a real authentic relationship to occur. But to try to partner and engage with organizations that never want to say they're sorry or not willing to do the due diligence and homework around what part they played in perpetuating this reinforcing loop of oppression through their organizations, then it's just very, very difficult to move forward. So the work around history is really a gateway towards healing, right? And how can we acknowledge, and begin the process of repair and healing. And I think that, more than anything, we need more healing in this world today, and in particular in the environmental sector. And I think that Big Greens are uniquely positioned to call out injustice and really be on the forefront of the healing and repair work that we need to do collectively as a community.
So if I could, I think so much wisdom in your observations, and especially the use of the term acknowledgement, because I think that is often lost in translation. So we have a lot of big greens who are so focused on the science. They're so focused on measuring and analytics and what I'll call the academic side of the work, that they forget about the points that you're making in terms of healing, relationships, authenticity. They don't take the time for that. And they do it to their detriment because they get rolling down, a path. They think that they can think for communities. They think they are, better suited to determine outcomes. And then when they get slapped by a community that says, you've not done your homework, you don't know what the implications are, you don't know what the history, there is no relationship here, then that's what creates the tension and the controversy, because they haven't taken the time to do exactly what you said, and that is initially the acknowledgement and the recognition of the fact that they are not truly engaging with the communities that are disproportionately impacted by so many of the decisions that they make. And so there has to be somebody there who's willing to speak up. I think Latrice made that point. Are you going to show up? Are you going to speak up? Are you going to raise that as an issue? And the absence of that goes back to your earlier points about just window dressing. So.
Thanks to all of you. I don't know if Latrice, if there's anything you wanted to add before we wrap up. Great. So I do appreciate, and I just wanted to pause and see if anyone has any last minute questions in our audience before we begin to wrap up this session. Okay. So we are at the end of our time together, and I want to offer an appreciation to each of our panelists, Latrice and Rose and Nathaniel. Thank you very much for being our speakers today and for offering such wonderful insights and thoughts around just how organizations can better address recruitment and retention and readiness of Black leaders onto their boards. So we want to put in we have put in a brief link to an evaluation, and that will be very important to us as we continue to plan activities. And so please take a few minutes to complete it, because your input is very valuable for us as we move forward with activities around Race to the Board and In Deep. So I hope that those who joined us today are walking away with some great insights. I hope you jotted down the questions that our panelists gave for you to think about within your work and your organizations. And for more information about In Deep and Race to the Board, there we do have our website, indeepinitiative.org, where you can take a look and check out past blog posts, reports, the toolkit that we mentioned earlier, and other videos that we've done within the In Deep series. So thanks to our panelists, first and foremost, for taking the time out today, and thanks to all of you who participated and joined in to listen. And I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks all.